Hey! Hi, how you doing? This is Ryan, and welcome back to the Gamertron Show. Now, all of you guys voted that you wanted a video about good combat in video games, so here it is. But given the vast complexity and depth on this topic, we need to lay down a few ground rules. This video will be mainly focused on action video games, particularly first-person, third-person, and 2D action video games. We will not be discussing turn-based games, strategy games, or fighting games. Reason being, the combat design found in those game genres is vastly different when compared to shooters, hack and slashes, and beat-em-ups. In turn-based games and strategy games, their version of combat follows very different design philosophies. Fighting games may have a few more reasonable connections that you could make, but still, even so, fighting games still have a different design philosophy in the end to your regular old action video game, your shooters, your hack and slashes, and your beat-em-ups. Also, as a side note, I am totally out of my depth when it comes to turn-based games and fighting games. I simply do not have enough experience in those types of games to make accurate assessments and arguments about. So this video will consist of and focus on shooters, hack and slashes, and beat-em-up action video games. Now, with that important context and preamble out of the way, let us begin. What is good combat in video games? What is objectively well-made combat design in video games? Because you see, this is something we can determine objective quality for. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but this is not a subjective subject matter. This is something we actually have a determining criteria for. While of course personal preference, subjective tastes will always come into play in terms of what video games and video game combat design you personally like and enjoy. But in no way is that a determining factor for whether or not combat in a video game is good or bad. This is a subject matter that we can actively prove and disprove via the four main pillars of combat design. Those four pillars being, in order from most important to least important, feedback, information, control, and spectacle. Now, starting with feedback, why is feedback the most important when designing and creating video game combat? Because feedback is the end result of the player's actions, and you always want to reward the player for their actions. Rewarding the player with feedback is paramount. Feedback resulting from the player's interaction with the video game is what separates video games from, say, movies. Yes, now with a movie, you can pause it, you can rewind it, you can fast forward it, but you can't manipulate the outcomes of anything during a movie. The progression of the story, the direction of the action scenes, that is all set in stone. That is done. That is static, that is out of the viewer's control. But with a video game, the player has agency. You can manipulate the world in-game. You can choose and change how the story progresses. You are essentially the director when it comes to action scenes. What makes video games so special from other forms of media is their interactivity. So, that interactivity within video games, the feedback you get from it, the visual and audio feedback the player receives for their actions in-game, is the primary factor that separates the serviceable from the exemplary. But what even is feedback in a video game? Essentially, it's an illusion. It's a magic trick. The use of visuals and sound to manipulate your brain into believing that your actions in-game have power and weight behind them. A physical presence, even though that's not even remotely true at all, because remember, this is just a video game. It's all just data. It's all just ones and zeros, pixels, molded and modeled, to vaguely resemble something that we associate with real life. Even with a stylized, cartoony design and presentation, characters, locations, and sounds will all be somewhat based off the human experience and perspective. Feedback is tied to every aspect of your video game, not just combat. So if the feedback is lacking, it will be noticeable and it will compromise the entire experience. So, those animations, those visual effects, those sound effects, anything that is the result of the player's actions needs to have effort put into their construction. Because a lack of effort put into player feedback will be seen, it will be heard, it will be felt. Up next, we have the second most important core pillar of combat design in video games: Information. Now this is pretty straightforward and speaks for itself. How much damage the player deals to enemies? How much damage enemies deal to the player? What is the range of the player's attacks? What is the range of the enemy's attacks? How much health does the player have? Are there any indicators that elements of the environment are interactable? Numbers. Numbers. Health percentage, stamina percentage, number of items in your inventory, bullets in the magazine until you have to reload if this is a shooter per se. Information, a player's tolerance threshold, and how acceptably fair a player will consider your game to be is entirely dependent on the information you give them. Now, most video games provide information via the UI, user interface. Your health bar, stamina bar, energy meter, ammo count, your minimap, your current objective, enemy health bars and damage numbers that pop off them when you attack them. If you've played any video game ever, you know what I'm talking about here. This information is key to helping players understand the fundamentals of how a game works, how it behaves. Now, what I'm about to say next, some may argue is subjective because of the existence of a lone contrarian. But in this case, I'm going to retort with, fuck that shit. Majority rules in this scenario. Overwhelmingly, most people in general are frustrated when they don't understand something, when they are confused by something, when something doesn't make sense to them. So when a video game fails at relaying crucial information to the player, then the player cannot appropriately react to whatever may be happening during gameplay, which inevitably leads to frustration and dissatisfaction. I do want to point out, however, so that there's no misunderstanding, the user interface is not the sole means of providing information to the player. Obviously, information can also be provided by animations, special effects, and certain audio sound cues. There are multiple means of providing useful information to the player, and when a video game lacks in providing information, it can be seen and it can be felt. And it will have an effect on how players engage in combat in any particular video game. Next core pillar of video game combat design: control. This one is pretty obvious and mostly self-explanatory. The button mapping, whether it be on your controller or mouse and keyboard, how long it takes your in-game avatar to respond to your inputs, and just how many inputs and interactions the players have access to in general. Surely you've heard the phrase before from someone playing a bad video game, "Oh man, it feels like I'm fighting the controls here. It feels like I'm fighting the game." A game's controls, which connect the in-game avatar to the player, need to make the player feel like the in-game avatar is an extension of the player's will. So if the button mapping feels off, if the input delay is too significant, if the interactions available within gameplay are too limited, it most certainly will be felt and it will affect the overall experience. However, in a certain context, if a game has good feedback and good information, it can at times compensate for bad controls. While the overall quality of combat gameplay will be affected, the redeeming factors can uplift the complete product. Finally, we come to the least important pillar of combat design in video games: spectacle, which encompasses presentation, style, superfluous things like explosions, blood and gore, bright colors, various special and artistic effects. Spectacle does not make or break games. It is in no way the most important factor of game design that will determine whether a game is good or bad. If your video game looks flashy and unique, it won't matter if the game doesn't feel good to play. But that's not to say that spectacle can't absolutely be a benefactor. Having a bold and flashy presentation is certainly eye-catching. A cinematic set piece here and there can certainly add scale and drama. I also think it's safe to say that most people indulge in a little over-the-top violence here and there. So, while spectacle isn't integral, there's nothing wrong with having it, and it certainly can help. So, those are the 4 core pillars of video game combat design. These are the criteria that we can use to determine good and bad combat in video games. While there are other minor supporting pillars of combat design, such as fantasy fulfillment, implementation of challenge and difficulty, progression systems, metrics of player skill, while all of those things certainly add to a game's overall quality, if the feedback is bad, if the information is bad, if the control is bad, if the spectacle is bad, if not non-existent, then all those other pillars and elements of design really won't be able to make up for the game's shortcomings and its overall quality. Now, some of you are probably wondering why, throughout this video, have I not given any examples of good combat in video games? After all, this is a video called What Makes Good Combat in Video Games. Surely I'd want to showcase good combat from video games. But here's the thing. Before you can actually appreciate genuine quality combat design in video games, you need to see, you need to experience, and you need to understand bad combat. You need an example for comparison. You need to see combat in a video game that is deeply flawed, poorly designed, poorly constructed. You can't understand what's good without understanding what's bad. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you completely genuine, untampered with, unedited, unscripted gameplay from the 2018 video game, The Quiet Man. Christ almighty, that's so painful to watch. The feedback is fucked. The information is non-existent. The controls limited and self-sabotaging. And in this case, the spectacle is not only weak, but far too much focus was put on it. So, because the premise of The Quiet Man is that you're playing as a character who is deaf, the developers decided to mute and muffle all sound. So those are massive portions of feedback, information, and spectacle that are just gone, annihilated. Animations don't properly flow into one another. Punches and kicks don't actually connect with their targets, they're hitting the air in between. This totally messes with a player's perception. It fucks with your brain, and how you're supposed to absorb the information you're seeing on screen. Oh, and speaking of information, there's basically none. There's no health bars, or unique animations to detail whether the player's health or the enemy's health is low. There's no way to effectively predict enemy attacks. There's no way to effectively react to enemy attacks. There's no way to tell which of your attacks are more effective than others. But I would argue the worst of the worst out of everything we saw was what happened when the player got hit with a fucking machete. No unique animation, no unique sound effects or visual effects to represent that the player just took a shit ton of damage. No change to the character model showing a gaping wound where they just got fucking slashed by a machete. Not even a squirt of blood. But as awful as that is, there's still so much more. There's no lock-on system, so the player can't choose who they decide to attack. Your player avatar just randomly attacks any of the enemies on screen that he fucking feels like. The camera, you have no control over the camera, so it can actively at times get in the way and hinder you, obscure your vision. And the game's presentation, its style, its spectacle will interrupt the gameplay flow by playing random flashback cutscenes in the middle of combat in an awkward, unnatural way. Just about everything about the Quiet Man's combat gameplay is objectively bad. Bad feedback, non-existent information, bad control, poor and overdone spectacle. It's understanding why the combat of the Quiet Man is so bad that it can help you understand and appreciate video games with genuinely good combat. Games like Doom Eternal, Devil May Cry 5, Titanfall 2, Warframe, Destiny 2, For Honor, Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor and Middle-earth Shadow of War, the Batman Arkham games, the Dark Souls games, the Monster Hunter games, the Far Cry games, the majority of the games developed by Platinum Games, the Halo games, Horizon Zero Dawn, Days Gone, Remnant from the Ashes, Control, Outriders, and so many more games where you look at their feedback, their information, their control, their spectacle, and they meet all of the qualifiers. Keep in mind, however, that doesn't mean you will personally like or enjoy all of these video games. Personal taste and personal preference and all that. But if we are talking about good combat in video games, this is an objective subject. We can quantify it, we can qualify it, we can prove it, and we can disprove it. Whether or not you like or dislike a particular video game, any game with genuine, objectively good combat is something that we should appreciate, that we should observe, we should deconstruct. Not only to admire the impressive craftsmanship on display, but also to learn. To learn more about video game design and development, to learn more about ourselves and what we personally appreciate, to learn about this hobby, this medium, this art form that we all love so much. A video game having good combat is more than a video game just being fun, just being enjoyable. A video game with good combat is significant. It represents knowledge, passion, and what we strive for, what we desire as human beings. Anyways, that's been a video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know in the comment section down below, what are video games with combat that you absolutely love? I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear you share your examples of video games with good combat in the comment section down below. If you liked the video in any way, shape, or form, please hit the like button. It helps me out. If you want to help out and support this video, please share it on social media, Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook. And if you want to help out and support me directly, there are links to my Ko-fi and my Patreon in the description down below. Thank you again so much for watching. This has been a video, and I'll see you all later.